So questions and other things based on Midrash Q&A. That's what I've got written here. I'm not sure what that is or isn't, but it sounds like it's time for more questions. So what it is that we want to have discussed or interested in, bothered by, wrestling with, struggling with, excited by, etc. Yeah, go on.
So you can ask any question on the running one. So one of the, back in Los Angeles when I was living there, I was told about this one rabbi, Rabbi Rowe of the conservative movement, that the Exodus never happened, right? And it sparked a huge outrage in the Jewish community. And as observant Jews, I've heard people who are becoming more observant and growing all the time. What's the biggest piece of evidence that we have out there that we can point saying the Exodus happened with 100%?
Okay, so the question is, what's the evidence that Exodus happened? What's the strongest? Right, the background being that the way you're going, there was a conservative rabbi who said it didn't happen, right, and so what's our smoking gun? So good question. First of all, let's talk about what smoking guns won't be there, right? Very important to know what we are looking for and not looking for. There's only, what would be the evidence of the Exodus itself, right? What would we look for? You'd want someone to have written about it, but they did. It's in the Torah. That's actually your smoking gun. But who would not have written about it? The Egyptians. How do we know they wouldn't have written about it? Because there's only two types of writing in the ancient world, certainly in somewhere like ancient Egypt. Papyri, writing on paper, and that's more day-to-day. The average person couldn't afford much paper, didn't write much, but if you could find buried things, you'd find a lot of information on paper. And then monumental structures, big stone monuments, tombs, for example, where you have engravings where the pharaoh is buried or the priest is buried. Those are only ever propaganda. They're only ever telling us how amazing that person was. You simply, if all you ever had to go by was Egyptian tomb writing and monumental writing, you would think Egypt was it was very successful, right, civilization. But you would think this was never failed. Nothing ever went wrong. Even the Battle of Kadesh, a very famous battle which actually, I think it was in 1273 BC or something. Battle of Kadesh, where if you only had the Egyptian find, you would think it was a stunning military victory. And when the Hittites were discovered, and they wrote a very blow-by-blow detailed account of the battle, we discovered that it was actually not a great victory for the Egyptians at all. In the Egyptian tombs, it's only a victory. So you will not expect anything in any Egyptian tomb anywhere to say, oh, there was a problem. This god of the slaves is stronger than our god and inflicted lots of plagues on us and created problems for us. That's just not going to turn up. Where you might have thought you might get some evidence is in the papers. You might have somebody writing, we need to find some... What's that papyrus stuff? You need to...
The one that's in the British Museum.
There is, so there's so little papyri, right? There is one that sounds like terrible things going on, but when you date it to, it's not. What's for sure is that the average, here's the biggest problem of all. There are almost no surviving papyri anywhere in the lands that the Jewish people would have been. The Delta region of ancient Egypt simply doesn't have paper survival. Why? Because it's not a dry climate. It's not dry enough. It's like finding ancient writing is so incredible when you find it that it becomes a sensation, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1,000 years after Egypt, after Yetzias Mitzrayim, are unbelievable. They're in this incredibly dry environment. You've got them, but things like that are just incredibly rare. You got the Amarna letters, you got Elephantine, you got very, very little. In the Delta region, the area where Goshen would have been, where ancient Israel would have been, where we would have been, where the story of Mitzrayim would have happened, there is nothing surviving there. So there is no place we're going to find it within Egypt, therefore. What you can look for are two other things. One is how reliable the Torah is, right? And that we discussed yesterday. If you have reason to believe the Torah is reliable, you would expect it to be recorded by the Israelites themselves, and it is, right? Now, question, how's reliable the recording documents? That we discussed yesterday, belief in Torah, Min HaShamayim, and authenticity of the Torah. The second possible tool you could do that could add verification potentially is do details of the story match up? Because the alternative, because when it comes to the Torah, the hypothesis of it, remember, the Torah is given at the time it's given, then the people are witnesses themselves to the main events, right? The readers are witnesses. So we went through yesterday the discussion of could there be late authorship? How late could the authorship be, right? Because a critic is going to need to push for late authorship. That will allow them to make the things, give time for stuff to be made up. And we went through yesterday a lot of discussion as to why late authorship hypothesis doesn't really work well for the Torah, which makes the Torah very reliable. Now, if you want, there's a few other pieces of information that the details of the story are so precisely aligned with things we know about the time. For example, we know that there was a few centuries in which populations in Canaan would migrate down to Egypt between about the 19th to 15th centuries BCE, not after that point. You see it on the tombs, you see pictures of these Asiatic people coming down, which is when the Torah says it's happening, from the time of Abraham till the time of the Beis going to Mitzrayim. You got this few hundred-year span, and it's exactly the few hundred-year span when that's would be what would happen. A later author probably wouldn't have figured that out because it just wasn't happening, right? You see later on in the book of Ruth, they don't go there, they go to Moab when there's a famine, right? Different. You see the way they enslaved them. We have 15th century depiction in ancient Egypt of enslaving Semitic peoples and making them do brickwork, exactly as the Torah says, right? In one of the few, which again doesn't seem to have been done later on, in one of the few surviving paper papyri is about a taskmaster of the bricks complaining about meeting the quota that day, which is an issue the Torah makes essential issue. You see, so all the details are aligning. The other thing the Torah says happens, they also did avodah basada. The only other thing we discovered a picture of the slaves doing is avodah basada, is field work, right? So it's literally lining up to all the price Yosef was sold into slavery. Remember what it is in the Torah? 20 shekel. One of the things we know about the ancient world now is the different prices of slaves in different periods of time. At the time Yosef would have been sold, it was exactly 20 shekel. Later on, it changes. So there's so many micro details like this. Then you've got the fact there is a town called Ramses, which has now been discovered, which was for a few hundred years a store city. There's a debate over remember, most towns don't have a piece of writing saying this town is called Ramses or Pitom. Sometimes you can work it out, sometimes you can't. There's two possible sites called Pitom. One of them is exactly dated to when we say Yetzias Mitzrayim took place. We know where Sukkos was, a place called Cheku, right, which was a massive Semitic camping site. We know, there's a guy called James Hoffmeyer. He's a Christian. He's a big Egyptologist, and he wrote something. I keep forgetting the name of it. It's very frustrating, but basically, drops out of my mind. Dropped out of my mind a few days ago, then it came back. It doesn't matter. But you can look him up. He's one of the biggest Egyptologists in the world, and he says you can map every single site all the way up to where he believes the Yam Suf was. Interestingly enough, why now? How do we translate the Yam Suf in English today? Red Sea. But why do we call it the Red Sea? Because they dropped an E. Yam Suf means a reed sea. There's no reeds in the Red Sea. It's almost for sure not there, right? But where it's most likely to be, under the best archaeological guesses nowadays, is we now know the Sinai, where the sea meets the Sinai Desert today in the north, is not where it used to. It used to be further north. It used to be a lot further north. There was more land, and in fact, you can see the underwater topology, what would have been big lakes, huge lakes. Yam in Torah can refer to a lake too, like the Yam Kinneret, right? Huge lakes full of reeds. If a lake is 10 or 12 feet tall, you're going to have lots and lots of reeds on its border and going quite deep in. And that was probably a Yam Suf. You can see where Migdol would have been. Anyway, so he's got this whole map that he's drawn out of where he thinks it all took place. James Hoffmeyer. Don't expect everything to be in the Al-Pi Torah and Chazal. He's not one of doesn't have RM1 and things, but I think he broadly believes in the historicity of the Torah, partly through his own beliefs and partly through the archaeological tightness of the story. Like place by place, you can literally see it all. So there was a guy called, I've got a video on this where it goes more accurate details. A guy called Carlos Drew, I think was his name, worked, I believe, in oceanography in NASA, and they studied things like the impact of wind on water. And he was fascinated by James Hoffmeyer's map of where everything took place. And he's also fascinated by the fact that Torah itself describes Kriyas Yam Suf, although it's clearly a miraculous event, obviously, but taking place through Ruach Kodim, out of strong wind blowing all night. And that's what they do. He's like, this is my profession. I map wind blowing on water. What will it do? Create tsunamis and so on. And there's not lots of places in the world where if the wind blows all night, it splits the sea. The few places in the world where that happens, it will usually be a tornado so vast that no human could be standing there, right? So he models based on the maps they have for where this place would be, and he finds something interesting. If a wind blew at a certain speed that a human can tolerate, but it's a strong wind all night, the sea will actually split about 3 kilometers wide. And if at any point it stops, they'll just come crashing straight down upon itself. Now, do we say necessarily? If you read up the Midrashim, that's not exactly necessarily. It depends how literally you take Midrashim. I'm not saying yes or no. What I'm saying is you certainly have very strong grounds for everything fitting the story to very, very strong details. So that would already give you an indication that this is surprising. I mean, how would a human author, right, guess centuries later what the price of a slave was, when people migrated, what work they did, what cities they built, which routes they took out in places that no longer existed and hadn't existed for centuries, and call the splitting of the sea in the one place on earth where if the wind does blow all night, it actually splits, and it never did in history, right? So, and then comes crashing down. That would be a remarkable thing. So is that a smoking gun? I don't know, but it's pretty good, right? Then if you add to that, much more importantly, which is the group that says it got out there, did record the whole story, and you then get into the discussion we had yesterday of the fact that we have evidence for the accuracy of Torah and evidence for early authorship of Torah, all of these things then put to a picture where you've got the live report sitting right there.
For those of us who weren't there, what's the key that we have that pushed it all the way down?
Okay, so for those who weren't there yesterday, and again, I've got videos on this you can watch for those who do watch videos, stuff that I could go through stuff. But for those who weren't there yesterday, I'll give a very, very brief summary. We were discussing the difference between the human authorship hypothesis and the divine authorship hypothesis. And when you come to arguments of Torah min hashamayim for divine authorship of Torah, things like the 7 wonders of Jewish history, the prophecies that come true, the national revelation, all these things, a critic's always got to push the dating. If they want to try to weaken these arguments, they've got to make the dating as late as they possibly can. Right? They've got to make huge chunks of Torah to be, let's say, Second Temple, for the simple reason then you've got an exile that you came back from, or then you've got enough time to make up and evolve a story, or etc. etc. We went through yesterday what some of those arguments are or not. I'll give you just 1 or 2 very, very quick examples of arguments I gave that I think are totally convincing, that there's no possible way the Torah is being even slightly edited after the 10th century BCE. That means the maximum wiggle room you got is about 2.5 centuries, maybe not even. And that's too little. And you're miles before, you're certainly right in proximity to the national revelation. You can't play at that point. That's even if you wanted to be the biggest skeptic alive, you couldn't push the Torah that late, although critics do. And I'll just recap 1 or 2 of the arguments. Are people together with me where we're up to in this discussion? Okay, some of you, it's a recap from yesterday. Do you remember? So one of the things I said is like this. Take any hypothesized late author, post 10th century BC. Post the 10th century BCE, what is the most important city in Israel? Jerusalem, right? That building there, all the way down that hill, is Yerushalayim. If Ezra was writing something to try to manipulate the people and get them to want to come to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, Jerusalem is his most important place. If it's Chizkiyahu or his scribes or the priests who want everyone to Jerusalem, if it's Yeshua, which is why Jerusalem is the most mentioned word in Nach, most mentioned name of any city or person in Nach, 700 times. It's great. There isn't a book of Nach that doesn't mention Jerusalem. Eov, a book of suffering. It can't help, but you just can't in ordinary talk. Mishlei, Proverbs, Esther, happens over there in Persia. Still, Jerusalem. All of them, Shir Shirim, Song of Songs, Jerusalem. You can't have a 10-minute conversation with an Israelite in those days who doesn't mention Jerusalem. It's not possible. And any of these people's primary motivation would have been to make sure Jerusalem was really holy to God from time immemorial. So that's why it's in every book of Nach except for 1, the Torah. The only book that didn't mention the word Jerusalem. Now, we are Peter Shabbat Pesach, but that place, Maria really is Yerushalayim, right? Shalem really is Yerushalayim, fine. But if you're a human writing that, you don't want to rely on somebody relying on some tradition. You put it in there. It doesn't exist. Clearly, if a human was writing the Torah, they would have had to have written it before the 10th century BCE. It is not possible a human who's manipulating the text and adding chunks in to get you to all want to see the centralized monarchy in Jerusalem forgot to mention Jerusalem. And all you have to do is change Shalem to Yerushalayim. It's so easy. All you have to do is add 1 verse while you're adding all this stuff about exiles. Just then, when you return from exile, Kivosem el Oretz at Yerushalayim Irkodshi Tivneli Beis. Boom. That's it. But that second part is also critical. It's so easy to put in. It's so many places could have asked for it. You could have rewritten the story. Not a problem at all. And here's the other incredible thing. The most important building after the 10th century BCE is Beis HaMikdash. If you're Ezra and you're squabbling with the locals here and you're trying to write a text and get Jews to want to build the temple despite all the, you've got to mention that Beis HaMikdash. If you are Chizkiyahu, if you are Yoshua, any of these people, any priest, any king, you want that front and center. Guess what never appears in the whole Torah? The Beis HaMikdash. Nowhere. What you have is chapter after chapter of how to build a mishkan, how to weave the threads, how to put the zav and tcheles, the gold and the blue wool and the this wool and how to weave this layer and that layer and how the sockets go and how you place them together. You can't have greater proof that this is written in the time as a mishkan, and it's not even edited or redacted afterwards. Because if it was King David editing it, or Ezra, or a priest, or a scribe, or a Chizkiah, or this, they would have added something, kids. Even if they don't want to manipulate the old text, just that have added some line about and build me a house in Yerushalayim, my holy city. So there's lots of other evidence. If you want one other tiny little piece of evidence, Hebrew language, like all languages, evolves and develops. We say it evolves to the point where Hashem wants it to be, right? There's a plan of where Hebrew would get to. But you can still trace the changes in the Hebrew language in every generation. And like all languages, it will always borrow words from other languages. Again, Hashem can put the word via the other language and bring it back in. So modern Hebrew has lots of words borrowed from English, and some from Arabic, and some from Russian, because as you contact these civilizations, your words enter. So in a Hebrew dictionary, you'll have words that clearly are English words, like televizia, etc., etc. So you can always tell which point in history a Hebrew book is written by what words it's borrowing from which cultures. For example, any book written after the 8th century in Nach has Assyrian words that became Hebrew words and Assyrian concepts, right? Any book written in the second exile period will have Babylonian words and Persian and Akkadian, just in the Hebrew. I'm not talking about when they quote explicitly, in the Hebrew itself. So there's a guy called Benjamin Noonan who's been through all the books of Nach, looking at exactly when each one's written, and most of them are exactly where you predict. And guess what? The Torah has no words from the 8th century. It doesn't have anything from the Assyrian. No words from the later centuries of the Babylonian and the Persian. It doesn't have any like Hebrew. The only indication of the Hebrew language, the only loan words it has, are Egyptian 13th to 10th century loan words. That's it. Which tells you this book is being written by a civilization that had intense contact with Egypt somewhere between the 13th and 10th century BC. Hebrew, correct. What about the word Kruvim? Okay, no, so good point. See, there's Karavia, right? And you've also got Totafos. Rashi says they're like the African words. But what they're really doing is they're saying we can learn the meaning of the Hebrew by comparing it to another language, the assumption being that languages are related. So, for example, Totafos tefillin, where Rashi says tat and pat, one is Afriki and one, right? Doesn't mean that the Hebrew went to Africa and picked up the words. It means just like in Hebrew you got these words, which we don't have another usage, you can sometimes see a parallel word in another language and therefore deduce what the Hebrew might mean. That's what it means in that case. But actually, archaeologically and scientifically, we wouldn't say that's where the word comes from. So whereas we can see the words that really, really are actual loan words, where they really did come from the other language. Again, Hashem can bring a word through another language into Hebrew when he needs the Hebrew to be the Lashon HaKodesh for the Torah to be written in. But the point is that one way or another, you can date exactly when the Torah is. By the way, it does have one Aramaic phrase, Yagar Sahadusa, but that explicitly says Laban is speaking in his language, right? And we call it Galed. So all of this points in one direction, which the Torah is clearly written, at least by certainly no later than the 10th century BC, finished being edited and redacted. And that leaves you with an inescapable conclusion then. And clearly something to do with Egypt too, right? So there's not enough time to make this story up and all these stories up, and certainly not enough time to make the prophecies in the Torah written after they've happened, etc. So all of this is a summary but those together provide the auxiliary evidence and the smoking gun evidence of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus of Egypt. By the way, one of the biggest questions people used to ask against the Exodus, one of the biggest smoking guns against it is, allegedly, so where are these 600,000 or hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews wandering in the desert? How come we haven't found archaeologically any camps of the Jews in the desert and then entering the land of Israel? That's the question people have asked, right? That's what persuaded people like you're quoting, I suspect, to start to cast real doubt on the credibility. Okay, but that was a plausible argument until about 2019. What happened in 2019? I was waiting for you to ask that. What happened in 2019? There's an archaeologist called Erez Ben Yosef from Tel Aviv University, and he has been digging down south in the Arava Desert, on north of Eilat, where it's known that there's an enormous amount of mines over there. Just around Timnah alone is around 10,000 copper mines in 1 century alone. That's like 100 mine shafts a year. That is a colossal workforce that you need. How many people do you need to dig in those days? Copper mines, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Here's the problem. If you have thousands of workers, who feeds them? You can only have thousands of workers working for months down a mine if you control hundreds of thousands of farmers and can take their surplus food as tax and feed them. You take the workers as tax, you take the surplus food as tax. So you're talking about an empire of hundreds of thousands of people. Here's the most incredible thing. If they had not dug, and they date to about the 10th or 11th centuries BCE, right? If they had not dug copper mines, do you know something? We would not know they existed. It's Edom. Archaeologists used to think Edom only existed in the 7th century BCE. It was one of the great questions they asked on the Torah. The Torah puts them much earlier than that. Now we know Edomites existed, but we know more than that. They are archaeologically invisible. Hundreds of thousands of people. How are they archaeologically invisible? There's a simple answer. Archaeology is the study of human remains. People who live in tents do not leave human remains, full stop. If they build full permanent settlements where they have stone structures, then there'll still be buildings that remain centuries later. There'll usually be an ashpa area, right? Yeah, like you have in the Gemara, ashpa, these dump heaps, where you'll often still find bones of animals they ate. Okay, most will be blown away in the wind, but some will remain and survive. You might find zoology and botany, like certain things you can, under a microscope, work out what they are. People who live in tents, it turns out, don't do that. Even if they only move every so often, they never leave those types of structures. And what it means, and he writes this, Erez Ben Yosef has academic articles. He's also got popular articles in the Times of Israel, in Haaretz, where he says this. He says, we need to rethink our understanding of ancient Israel, because guess where ancient Israelites lived, according to the Torah? In tents. Well, yeah, but they moved through the Sinai Desert, they live in tents. And when they get into Israel, they live in tents. Only Levium moved into anything resembling little cities or towns, right? So much so that you'll see in the book of Joshua, they're conquering cities. And then in the book of Judges, Shoftim, they're conquering them again. Because cities were kind of control areas where you controlled hinterland. They didn't occupy the cities, they didn't move into them. Right? Even much later, after King Shlomo, after King Solomon, when Rechavam tries to exert power over the nation and the northern kingdom rebels, after they say we're going to ignore Rechavam, they say, you Yisrael, shuvu la'ahalechem, go back not to your cities and towns, back to your tents. Even after Shlomo Melech has built at least 3 cities. Most Jews lived in tents, which means archaeologically, they are going to be invisible. You simply will never find them. Yeah, because people lived in lands and lived in tents. Cities is a whole new type of urbanization. Lots of people didn't like going into cities. Lots of cultures didn't do it. The old days, says Ben Yosef, we always knew there were these nomadic people. We just never knew how to archaeologically deal with them when we did populations of the ancient world. So you know what they did? They would take contemporary nomadic populations and project those backwards. Everybody knew it was ridiculous, but nobody had a better method. Now you have actual evidence of hundreds of thousands of people in a very sophisticated empire who've proven to us they existed in the ancient world the way the Torah describes it, and they don't leave an archaeological trace. So what you have to look for is the circumstantial evidence, which we've done, and the authenticity of the Torah, which we've spoken about separately. Yeah. Yeah, it depends. It all depends. For example, you buried people in the desert, and then wind came and exposed it, and then hyena came and ate them. But yeah, they don't have remains of the Moabites. They don't have their remains. Now it goes. You know, when you've got much more solid earth and you're in one place and you can keep the cemetery for years, and so then it will stay there. If you're marching through the desert for 40 years, you're not going to just, that's right, that's the evidence.
When you expect even some, we're talking about none.
Right? I'm saying the Moabites also leave none. Hundreds of thousands of people for centuries. It's not they left none at the time, it's they didn't survive into the centuries. Or maybe somewhere there's the odd skeleton which nobody's quite dug up or found, but you're not going to have mass. Like once you move into cities, then you'll find stuff centuries and centuries and centuries later and lots of it. Even then, not always necessarily